A young boy is walking along a river on the southern tip of Africa. He looks across the rolling hills, the mountains, and the plains, and the animals in the wilderness. He sees that he is a part of this natural world, as his kin have been for tens of thousands of years. When he turns to the river, he sees fish frolicking in the water, and he feels content that his ancestors are watching over him. He hears a strange sound, one he has never heard before. He looks up and sees tall, pale-skinned strangers on a ship entering the river's mouth where the sea meets it. They are speaking in strange tongues, and even from this distance his heightened sense of smell is raised by the men's perfume-ridden bodies. The boy doesn't know it yet, but his entire world is about to be turned upside down. Invasion is here, or, as the tall, pale-skinned strangers call it, colonization. Hello and welcome to the channel. I am that one History G, and in this video we will introduce the San and the Khoikhoi to Europeans. We have discussed their lives up to this point in parts number 1 to 3. So if you haven't watched those yet, please go watch them first. The links are in the description of this video down below. And while you're there, you can also please like, comment, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. During this video, we'll also discuss what the likes of Snoop Dogg and Ludacris have to do with an ancient band of people like the San. Now, let's get into it. The San and the Khoikhoi were somewhat isolated in the southern African plains, but they had some interactions with other African tribes that were slowly but surely making their way down the African continent. But what they were about to experience was beyond their wildest imaginations. With the introduction of the Portuguese explorers, the San and the Khoikhoi were introduced to the known European world. The initial interaction between the Khoikhoi and the European sailors was mostly a peaceful one. Some trade, but they were also suspicious of each other and they avoided each other mostly. There were some acts of violence as well. The Khoikhoi were naturally curious and suspicious of these never seen before white people, as they had never witnessed their dress, their language, their actions, and their smell. When Bartholomew Dias, a Portuguese man, arrived in 1488, they would come across a group of people which owned livestock, the Khoikhoi. There were no significant encounters between each group because they stayed to themselves. But in 1497, Vasco da Gama arrived in the Cape with very different experiences. He was met by the Khoikhoi with violence, and it led to some of his sailors becoming wounded. Later sailors from later expeditions would attest to this violence. The Khoikhoi were simply trying to defend their territory and their possessions. However, these acts of violence actually did the Khoikhoi the world of good, because it postponed the settlements and imperialism of European nations, as the Portuguese decided to avoid the Cape altogether and tried to set up different refreshment stations along Madagascar and Mozambique. The Khoikhoi were, however, not let off that easily. When the Dutch set up a company called the VOC, the VOC, they wanted to bring goods from the Far East to Amsterdam and Europe, but that was a mighty far distance if you had ships. So they sent a man called Jan van Riebeeck in 1652 to go around to the halfway point between India and Amsterdam, and that was the Cape of Good Hope. Cape Town, South Africa, where I'm actually from. I was born there. And here, the Dutch were charged to build a refreshment station for ships going from the Far East to Europe. It wasn't so successful in the beginning. They struggled to grow crops in the sandy undergrowth, and they were plagued by political infighting. But nonetheless, they made it work, unfortunately, for the Khoikhoi and the San. Now I'm going to give you the oversimplified rundown of what happened next. As the Dutch secured themselves in the Cape, they fenced off farmlands, which meant that the Khoikhoi and the San couldn't use those lands. They had no idea of possessive lands, and they were forced north to find better pastoral and hunting grounds, where they were met with different tribes who were coming down from the north, the Ubuntu tribes from East Africa, which were looking for pastoral and farmlands of their own. So the Khoikhoi and the San were forced to move into even northerner regions. Then the British arrived in 1806 and they set up their own colony. and the Dutch people in that area had reduced in their power. But the Dutch people in that area weren't friends with the British. They felt more African than European, and they started to call themselves Afrikaners, a Dutch word for African, because they had been living there for generations, and they didn't want anything to do with the British. They moved north, away from the Cape, in something called the Great Trek in 1835, where 12,000 to 14,000 individuals marched north in a rebellion against the British government. This was the real start of the tension growing for the Boer War between the Afrikaners and the British. But what happened to the Khoikhoi and the San? Well, they were forced into the desert regions that no one really wanted. Hence, they ended up in the Kalahari Desert because for some weird reason cows don't like eating sand and crops refuse to grow in the desert. It's actually the San people that came out on top against the Khoikhoi, as the Khoikhoi had to revert to their hunter-gatherer lifestyle because they couldn't keep their cattle alive. If the Khoikhoi and San had stayed in the lush green Cape, they would have either been wiped out or forced to work as slaves on settler farms. They've been forced out so many times by so many different people. Well, that unfortunately is not going to be the last mass exodus. There were even settlers that tried to push north into the San territories, but the San had had enough and fought back with bows and arrows against musket rifles. At this time, the San had actually become really good traders who had crossed deserts in caravans to trade with the Bantu tribes for ivory, animal skins, and even mined materials. However, all of this was set to change in 1884 when the German Southwest Africa was established in modern-day Namibia. German settlers arrived and they found diamonds in San territory. Well, you can imagine what happened next. They had the first mass genocide of the 21st century. Forcing the San people to move further into the Kalahari Desert. But this time, unfortunately for the San, they couldn't just run away from the settlers, who rounded up the San and forced them to work on their farms and mines. The settlers decided they could solve their bushmen problem with education through hard labor, by taking their children from their families and placing them in remote areas to be laborers. After World War I, Germany lost their colony to South Africa. But it changed nothing for the San. They were met with the same brutality. Still, however, there were some places where the San people still lived in relative peace in central Kalahari Desert in the modern-day Botswana region. But the majority of the San people became Southern Africa's cheap labor force. When the South African border war kicked off in 1966, the South African apartheid government employed the San hunting skills to track down their enemies, who were the SWAPO freedom fighters, who were backed by the Soviet Union, contesting the apartheid state of South Africa, who were supported by the US and other Western powers. Within the war, the San people became the most militarized ethnic group on earth and gained legendary status within the South African army. But at the fall of the Berlin Wall, the conflict stopped, and Southwest African province of South Africa became its own country, Namibia, in the early 90s. After this, the San people were left with only small pockets of land, such as Nene in Namibia, which wasn't large enough to support their traditional hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and they had to be supported by the government of Namibia and charities so they could survive. In Botswana, it got even worse for the San people, as in the early 1990s, diamonds were found in the Central Kalahari Game Reserve, and the government, you guessed it, kicked them out, which led to a court case in 2005 where they appealed to, and I quote, "our black brothers and sisters of the hip-hop industry, Russell Simons, Snoop Dogg, Ludacris, and all other household names to help us. We know you love wearing our diamonds. If you love wearing stones so much, you can at least help us pressure our government to let us go home. Please, don't let us perish for your bling." They eventually won the case, but in the end, they weren't allowed to go back to their homes. What I think is really interesting is that if we study people that live in a different way, it can give us living in the modern world a different perspective of our origins and question ourselves why our ancestors gave up a nomadic lifestyle. Today, however, the life of the San is quickly ending due to fencing off of nature, and at the end of the day it comes down to the San perhaps to join the modern world. But it's not anyone's decision, but theirs to make. So, if you're ever feeling down and hard done by, spare thought for the San people. We're the original people of this world, but due to us, their world is quickly disappearing. Thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you want to watch next by commenting down below. The more you know.